July 27, 1943, 22:47 hours, Flak Tower 4, Wilhelmsburg District, Hamburg. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Brenner adjusted the dials on his Würzburg radar array, watching green blips dance across the cathode ray screen like fireflies in the darkness. Through the reinforced concrete observation slit, the Elbe River stretched before him, its black waters reflecting the scattered lights of Germany's second-largest city. In his breast pocket, carefully folded, lay a photograph of his daughter Emma, building sandcastles on the Baltic coast just 3 weeks earlier, her laugh frozen in silver gelatin, her future seemingly secure behind the Reich's mighty air defenses. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The British won't dare come again so soon, he had written to his wife Greta that morning after the previous night's raid had been driven off with acceptable losses. Our flat curtain is impenetrable. They learned their lesson. The words carried the confidence of a man who had tracked and helped destroy 17 RAF bombers over the past year, each victory marked with a small chalk line on the bunker wall behind his station. Air Marshal Harris may send his terror fliers, but Hamburg's children sleep safely under our protection. In 18 hours, this same radar operator would be found catatonic at his post, staring at a screen that showed not individual aircraft, but solid masses of light, his equipment overwhelmed by a formation so vast that the Würzburg circuits had simply overloaded and died. The photograph of Emma would be clutched in his trembling hands, its edges burned from the heat radiating through the bunker's walls, while outside, the city he had sworn to protect writhed under an inferno that would consume 61 square kilometers and transformed 43,000 human beings into ash and memory. Though Brenner would later testify to Allied interrogators that his radar had detected over 800 individual bombers, military historians note this was likely an underestimate, as the electronic warfare measures employed that night had blinded most detection equipment well before the main force arrived. The mathematics of strategic bombing were about to be rewritten, not in tactical manuals or staff studies, but in the horrified testimonies of survivors who would witness the birth of modern area warfare from beneath its crushing weight. The Luftwaffe's defensive network stretched across the Reich like a spider's web of steel and electronics, what Reichsmarschall Goering had proclaimed the most sophisticated air defense system ever conceived. Along Hamburg's approaches, the 22nd Flak Division, commanded by General Major Alwin Woltz, controlled 54 heavy batteries, 26 light flak positions, and 22 searchlight companies, their interlocking fields of fire designed to create what German tacticians called the flaming curtain of death. Air defense planners had calculated that any bomber formation attempting to penetrate Hamburg's defensive perimeter would face a gauntlet of 432 88mm guns, 180 105mm pieces, and over 600 smaller caliber weapons, all coordinated by the most advanced radar network in Europe. The city itself had been divided into defensive sectors, each with predetermined firing solutions and overlapping coverage patterns that promised to exact catastrophic losses from any attacking force. Oberst Heinrich Bombach, commanding Flak Regiment 241, had personally supervised the mathematical calculations that supported German confidence. His batteries could theoretically place 2,888mm shells in the air per minute, creating a steel umbrella that should shred any bomber formation attempting to approach the city. Combined with night fighter squadrons operating from Stade and Westerland, the defenses represented the culmination of 4 years of technological development and tactical refinement. The city's population had been conditioned to view air raids as manageable inconveniences rather than existential threats. Hamburg's civil defense system, organized by Oberregierungsrat Friedrich Ahrens, boasted 347 public bunkers, 1,021 reinforced cellars, and detailed evacuation procedures that had been tested and refined through dozens of previous raids. Citizens carried gas masks as routine accessories and could reach designated shelters within 3 minutes from any point in the city center. The industrial infrastructure that made Hamburg vital to the German war effort seemed equally protected. The submarine yards at Bloemenvass, where Type 21 U-boats were constructed, lay beneath massive concrete shelters that could withstand direct hits from the heaviest bombs in the RAF inventory. The synthetic oil refineries that fed the Luftwaffe's fuel requirements were defended by dedicated flak batteries and camouflaged to blend with surrounding residential areas.
German intelligence assessments, compiled by Oberst Joseph Schmid's Luftwaffe Intelligence Division, had analyzed RAF capabilities with methodical precision. British bomber losses over Germany averaged 4.2% per mission, unsustainable for prolonged operations. Coastal Command maritime patrols reported no unusual shipping concentrations in British ports. Photo reconnaissance flights detected normal activity at RAF bases across England. These calculations, however, failed to account for developments occurring in complete secrecy across the Atlantic. American industrial capacity was reaching unprecedented levels of production, churning out heavy bombers at rates that German planners considered mathematically impossible. The B-24 Liberator, with its extended range and heavy payload, was rolling off assembly lines in numbers that defied every pre-war prediction about democratic industrial capacity. More critically, German intelligence remained unaware of technological breakthroughs that would render their entire defensive philosophy obsolete overnight. In laboratories across Britain and America, scientists working under conditions of absolute secrecy had developed countermeasures to every aspect of German air defense, from radar jamming to chaff dispensing, technologies that would transform the coming raid from a conventional attack into something approaching technological warfare. July 26th had brought weather conditions that Luftwaffe meteorologists declared unfavorable for large-scale bombing operations. Cloud cover extended from ground level to 18,000 feet across the North Sea approaches. Visibility was less than 2 kilometers. Wind speeds at bombing altitude exceeded 45 knots from the northwest. Dr. Franz Georgi, chief meteorologist for Air Fleet Reich, assured defense commanders that such conditions would prevent accurate navigation and target identification for at least 4 days. Based on these forecasts, many units had stood down from maximum alert status. Flak crews were granted normal rest rotations. Night fighter squadrons reduced their patrol schedules. Even civilian air raid wardens were told to expect quiet nights until weather conditions improved. This meteorological confidence represented the first critical miscalculation in what would become a cascade of strategic failures. Unknown to German weather services, Allied meteorological capabilities had advanced dramatically since 1940. Weather reconnaissance flights operating from Scotland and Iceland provided detailed atmospheric data unavailable to Axis forecasters. More importantly, American bombing doctrine had evolved beyond the precision requirements that German planners assumed would prevent attacks in adverse weather conditions.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Fell within the range of previous RAF attacks. Flak Regiment 241 received standard alerts to prepare for imminent action. Night fighter squadrons at Stade scrambled 12 Messerschmitt Bf-110s under the command of Hauptmann Werner Streib, Germany's leading night fighter ace with 66 confirmed victories. What the radar operators were detecting, however, was merely the Pathfinder force of Operation Gomorrah, the code name for what would become the most devastating bombing campaign in European history. The main force, still forming up over the North Sea, consisted of 791 heavy bombers carrying a combined payload of 2,300 tons of explosives and incendiaries, supported by the largest electronic warfare operation ever mounted by Allied forces. The Pathfinders themselves carried a revolutionary innovation that German defenders had never encountered. Window. Strips of aluminum foil cut to specific lengths would be dropped in massive quantities to overwhelm German radar systems. Each bomber carried bundles containing millions of metallic strips, calculated to create false returns that would blind the Würzburg and Freya installations upon which the entire defense network depended. As the Pathfinder force approached Hamburg's defensive perimeter, they began releasing window in coordinated patterns designed by British scientists who had spent months studying captured German radar equipment. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Every radar screen, from the North Sea to Berlin, filled with thousands of false returns, transforming the orderly green display that operators had learned to read into chaotic snowstorms of electronic noise. Klaus Brenner, at his Würzburg station atop Flak Tower 4, watched in growing horror as his screen dissolved into meaningless static. Individual aircraft signatures vanished, replaced by solid blocks of light that moved and shifted like living things. His calls to other radar positions met with identical reports of complete system failure. The technological backbone of German air defense was collapsing in real time. Flak batteries deprived of radar guidance reverted to sound location and visual tracking methods that belonged to the previous war. Searchlight crews swept the sky desperately, their beams revealing nothing but empty darkness and occasional glints of aluminum chaff drifting like deadly snow. The precisely coordinated defense that had been the pride of the Luftwaffe was reduced to firing blind salvos into the night, hoping to hit targets they could no longer see. Night fighters found themselves in an even more desperate situation. Without ground control interception, pilots were forced to patrol vast areas of sky, searching visually for bombers that approached under cover of electronic invisibility. Werner Streib later reported that his entire squadron made contact with only 3 enemy aircraft during the first phase of the attack, shooting down 1 Halifax bomber at the cost of 2 German fighters lost to friendly fire from their own flak batteries. The psychological impact on German crews was immediate and devastating. Men who had spent years perfecting radar-guided interception techniques suddenly found their equipment useless. Flak gunners who had tracked precise firing solutions were reduced to guessing at invisible targets. The technological superiority that had sustained German confidence evaporated in minutes, replaced by the terrifying realization that their enemies possessed capabilities beyond their comprehension. At 00:57 hours on July 28th, the main force arrived over Hamburg. What the surviving defenders witnessed challenged every assumption about the nature of strategic warfare. The bomber stream stretched from horizon to horizon, a river of aircraft flowing overhead in formations so dense that individual planes were indistinguishable. Engine noise created a continuous thunder that shook buildings and shattered windows across the city. Lieutenant Frederick Torgay, an artillery observer stationed at the Rathaus, attempted to count the attacking aircraft until the impossibility of the task overwhelmed him. His official report, filed 3 days later from a field hospital outside Bremen, stated simply that he had witnessed more bombers than existed in the entire Luftwaffe. The formation appeared endless, wave after wave of 4-engine aircraft passing overhead with mechanical precision. The bombing pattern that followed revealed tactical innovations that German planners had never anticipated. Instead of attempting to hit specific industrial targets, the attackers employed area bombing techniques designed to create maximum destruction across the widest possible area. High-explosive bombs fell first, shattering water mains, gas lines, and emergency services infrastructure. Then came the incendiaries, thousands of them, turning the wounded city into a furnace. Hamburg's fire department, led by Oberfeldwebel Georg Ahrens, had prepared for conventional incendiary attacks based on previous RAF tactics. They possessed 42 fire companies with modern equipment and detailed response protocols. What they encountered on July 28th was beyond any emergency planning. The incendiary load was so massive and so concentrated that individual fires merged into conflagrations that consumed entire neighborhoods within minutes. The firestorm phenomenon, unknown to German civil defense planning, began developing around 01:30 hours. As thousands of separate fires coalesced, they created their own weather system, generating winds that reached hurricane force and temperatures that exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius at street level. The Hamburg Fire Department's carefully planned response collapsed as fire stations were overrun, water pressure failed, and equipment melted in the heat. Civilians who had taken shelter in basements and bunkers designed to protect against high explosives found themselves trapped in furnaces. The firestorm consumed oxygen from the air, suffocating those who survived the initial bombing.
Carbon monoxide filled underground spaces, creating death traps where families huddled together and died together, their bodies found days later in peaceful poses that belied the horror of their final moments. Emergency services reported scenes that challenged human comprehension. Streets where asphalt had melted and caught fire, trees exploding from internal steam pressure, rivers boiling from the heat of burning buildings along their banks. The temperature in some areas became so extreme that human bodies were reduced to ash without leaving recognizable remains, making casualty counts impossible to determine with accuracy. Hans Rumpf, serving as Hamburg's civil defense coordinator, attempted to maintain communication with rescue services across the city. His command post, located in a reinforced bunker beneath the city hall, lost contact with district after district as telephone lines burned and radio transmissions were drowned in static. By 300 hours, he was receiving reports from only 3 of Hamburg's 27 emergency sectors. The scale of destruction exceeded every category in German civil defense manuals. Previous raids had damaged buildings and killed hundreds. Operation Gomorrah was eliminating entire neighborhoods, erasing them so completely that subsequent rescue teams could not determine where streets had run or identify the remains of individual structures. The bombing had transformed urban warfare into something approaching geological change. Medical facilities faced catastrophes beyond their capacity to address. Dr. Elisabeth Weber, chief of surgery at Hamburg General Hospital, later testified that her facility received over 3,000 casualties in the first 4 hours after the bombing began. Many injuries were unlike anything in medical literature. Flash burns covering 90% of patients' bodies, carbon monoxide poisoning in victims who showed no external trauma, cases of suffocation where lungs had been seared by superheated air. Hospital staff worked without electricity, water, or adequate supplies as waves of injured continued arriving throughout the night. Many medical professionals were killed when the hospital's surgical wing was directly hit.
Struck by a cluster of incendiary bombs, Dr. Weber performed amputations by candlelight until smoke forced evacuation of the remaining patients, many of whom died during transport to facilities outside the city. As dawn broke on July 28th, Hamburg's defenders confronted the full magnitude of their failure. The sophisticated air defense system had managed to shoot down only 12 attacking bombers, a loss rate of 1.5% that represented complete tactical failure. German fighter squadrons had made minimal contact with the enemy. Flak batteries had expended thousands of shells without achieving meaningful results. The city itself presented a landscape that seemed drawn from apocalyptic imagination. 61 square kilometers were burning or completely destroyed, an area larger than the entire city of Munich. Residential districts that had housed 180,000 people had simply vanished, leaving only rubble-filled basements and twisted metal where neighborhoods had stood for centuries. Casualty estimates varied wildly in the immediate aftermath, partly because many victims had been completely incinerated, leaving no remains to count. Hamburg police reported 43,000 confirmed dead, but acknowledged that thousands more were missing and presumed killed. An additional 125,000 people were listed as wounded, though many injuries were so severe that victims died days or weeks later without ever being properly treated. The industrial damage was equally catastrophic. The submarine construction yards that had been Germany's priority for naval warfare were burning ruins. Synthetic fuel facilities that supplied the Luftwaffe were destroyed beyond repair. Port facilities that had handled crucial imports from occupied territories were twisted wreckage extending into the Elbe River. The city that had contributed significantly to Germany's war production was effectively eliminated as an industrial center. Reich Marshal Göring flew to Hamburg on July 29th to assess the damage personally. His inspection, documented in Luftwaffe records, lasted less than 2 hours. Confronted with destruction that exceeded his worst nightmares, he ordered the immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel from German cities and authorized the construction of massive underground bunkers that would consume resources desperately needed for aircraft production. The psychological impact on German leadership was profound and immediate. Intelligence reports confirmed that Allied bomber capabilities had advanced far beyond German estimates. The raid represented not just tactical success, but technological revolution. Window had rendered German radar systems obsolete overnight. The scale of the attack demonstrated industrial production capabilities that challenged Nazi assumptions about democratic military capacity. Local Nazi Party officials, who had assured Hamburg's population that Reich air defenses were impregnable, found their credibility shattered along with their city. Gauleiter Karl Kaufmann, who had publicly promised that Hamburg would never fall to enemy action, was evacuated to Berlin after receiving death threats from survivors who blamed party propaganda for their unpreparedness. The broader strategic implications became clear within days of the attack. Allied Bomber Command had demonstrated the ability to destroy major German cities at will. The technological innovations employed over Hamburg could be replicated against any target in the Reich. German air defense, despite 4 years of development and enormous resource investment, was revealed as inadequate to counter Allied capabilities. Klaus Brenner, the radar operator who had begun July 27th with such confidence, was found at his post 18 hours after the attack began, still staring at his blank screen. Medical personnel who evacuated him reported that he clutched Emma's photograph so tightly that it had to be surgically removed from his palm. He never resumed radar duties and spent the remainder of the war in a military hospital diagnosed with what contemporary German
doctors called radar shock. His experience represented thousands of similar cases among Hamburg's defenders. Men who had trained for years to protect the city discovered that their skills, equipment, and preparation were worthless against enemies who had revolutionized warfare while they watched. The technological gap revealed at Hamburg was so vast that many German military professionals quietly concluded that the war was already lost, regardless of battlefield outcomes in Russia or the Mediterranean. The bombing of Hamburg marked the moment when strategic warfare entered the modern age. The attack demonstrated that industrial societies could be targeted for complete destruction, that civilian populations were as vulnerable as military forces, and that technological advantage could render traditional defenses meaningless. The German defenders had prepared for the war they understood, only to discover that their enemies were fighting an entirely different conflict. Oberst Bombach's precisely calculated flat curtain had been penetrated as easily as morning mist. The radar network that had seemed so sophisticated was blinded by strips of aluminum foil that cost pennies to produce. The night fighters that represented the pinnacle of German aviation technology were reduced to helpless spectators. Hamburg burned while its defenders watched, unable to comprehend, much less counter, the forces that were destroying their world. The citizens of Hamburg, who had trusted in German technological superiority and military competence, learned that modern warfare recognized no distinction between combatants and civilians, between military targets and residential neighborhoods. The firestorm that consumed their city was not the result of Allied barbarism, but of industrial mathematics applied to strategic bombing. They had become variables in an equation that reduced human lives to acceptable losses in pursuit of victory. The psychological transformation was complete and irreversible. Germany's second-largest city had been eliminated as a military asset in a single night. The survivors, scattered across the Reich, carried with them the knowledge that no German city was safe, that air defense was an illusion, and that the war had entered a phase where entire populations could be erased from existence by enemies they never saw. In trying to defend Hamburg, the German military had confronted the future of warfare and been found completely unprepared. They had brought 19th century tactics to a 20th century conflict, courage and determination to a contest decided by production statistics and technological innovation. The mathematics of strategic bombing had rendered their heroism irrelevant, their sacrifices meaningless, their defeat inevitable. Hamburg burned for 7 days and 7 nights, visible from aircraft flying over Denmark. The city that had survived the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic conflicts, and the Great War, was destroyed in a single evening by an enemy that treated urban destruction as a logistical problem to be solved through industrial efficiency. The age of total war had begun, and Germany's defenders learned that survival in such conflicts required not just military courage, but industrial supremacy they no longer possessed.
The morning of July 28th revealed Hamburg transformed into a landscape that existed beyond the vocabulary of destruction. Smoke columns rose 3 kilometers into the atmosphere, visible from reconnaissance aircraft operating over Denmark. The firestorm had created its own meteorological system, generating thunderclouds from the superheated air that produced rainfall mixed with ash and human remains. Streets that had existed for 8 centuries were now rivers of molten asphalt flowing toward the Elbe, carrying with them the dissolved remnants of a civilization. Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Schroeder, commander of Hamburg's Emergency Response Coordination, established his command post in a bunker 12 kilometers outside the city after his headquarters beneath the Rathaus became extremely unsafe. The bunker was unable to maintain communication with the emergency response teams, and Oberfuhrer Schroeder was forced to rely on bicycle messengers to coordinate the response to the disaster. The documents donated to the Imperial War Museum captured precisely the systematic unraveling of order in Hamburg's darkest hours. The entries from July 25th to 28th reveal a process of progressive degradation as a military force gargantuanly supplied with radar, communications, armor, and heavy flak slowly lost one communication channel after another until all coordination had ceased. Men and women who had been trained to react to reconnaissance footage, organize defense, and mobilize civic defense teams were totally unprepared for the nature of an attack designed for absolute destruction. A network that had seemed effortlessly capable of racing an uncontested sky, only to meet a fragile German military. Entries at the end of the documents, beginning on July 29th, note the absence of contact and the gradual elevation of the death toll as incoming reports continued. On August 1st, the death toll reached 35,000, with a final estimate of 42,500 lives. Until Hamburg was burned out, the firestorm remained as a physical indication of the technology of destruction that attacked Hamburg's defenders.
Uninhabitable. His first situation reports, transmitted to Berlin at 0847 hours, contained language that German military communications had never employed. Entire districts listed as geographically eliminated. Casualty estimates marked as incalculable due to complete incineration. Infrastructure damage assessed as beyond reconstruction capability. The numbers that emerged from Hamburg challenged German understanding of what bombing could accomplish. Previous Allied raids had damaged approximately 2 to 3% of targeted cities. Operation Gomorrah had eliminated 47% of Hamburg's residential areas in a single night. The firestorm had consumed 21,000 buildings completely, damaged another 43,000 beyond repair, and left 900,000 people homeless in a city that had housed 1.7 million inhabitants before the attack. General-Major Alwin Volz, whose 22nd Flak Division had promised impenetrable air defense, submitted his final report to Luftwaffe headquarters on July 30th. His defensive network had achieved a loss rate of 1.5% against the attacking force, compared to the 15% minimum required to make continued operations prohibitively expensive for Allied Bomber Command. More devastating than the tactical failure was the revelation that his entire defensive philosophy had become obsolete overnight. The technological gap exposed at Hamburg extended far beyond radar jamming. Allied bomber formations had employed precision timing that allowed 791 aircraft to attack a single target without colliding or interfering with each other's bombing runs. German intelligence had assumed such coordination was impossible for democratic air forces, believing that Luftwaffe discipline and training provided insurmountable advantages in complex operations. Post-attack analysis revealed Allied organizational capabilities that defied German preconceptions about enemy competence. The attacking force had originated from 47 different airfields across Britain, converged over the North Sea with split-second timing, penetrated German airspace in coordinated waves, and returned to their bases with losses so minimal that the operation could be repeated immediately.
The logistics alone represented industrial coordination that exceeded German theoretical capabilities. Window technology, the aluminum chaff that had blinded German radar, represented only the visible portion of Allied electronic warfare advances. Intelligence officers analyzing debris discovered sophisticated jamming equipment, navigation aids that operated independently of ground-based systems, and communication devices that allowed real-time coordination between aircraft separated by hundreds of kilometers. The technological revolution that had made Hamburg possible was comprehensive and systematic. Dr. Werner Osenberg, director of the Reich Research Council, flew to Hamburg on August 1st to assess Allied technological capabilities. His classified report to Heinrich Himmler concluded that Germany was facing enemies who had achieved breakthroughs in multiple scientific disciplines simultaneously. Electronic warfare, precision manufacturing, industrial chemistry, and organizational management had all advanced beyond German capabilities, while the Reich focused resources on conventional military equipment.
Intact. Inside, the victims appeared to be sleeping peacefully, killed by superheated air that had cooked their lungs without marking their skin. The sight broke veteran soldiers who had survived the Eastern Front without psychological damage. Medical facilities across northern Germany were overwhelmed by casualties whose injuries exceeded existing treatment protocols. Dr. Heinrich Miller, director of trauma surgery at Bremen General Hospital, documented burn patterns unlike anything in medical literature. Victims had suffered cellular damage at the molecular level, their bodies essentially cooked by temperatures that had exceeded the melting point of copper. Traditional burn treatments were completely ineffective against injuries of such severity. The psychological casualties proved as numerous and devastating as the physical ones. Hamburg survivors exhibited symptoms that German military psychiatrists had never encountered. Catatonia induced by witnessing impossible destruction. Acute anxiety triggered by aircraft sounds. Amnesia so complete that patients could not remember their own names or recognize family members. The firestorm had not merely killed bodies, but shattered minds that could not process the reality of what they had experienced. Gauleiter Karl Kaufmann, who had evacuated to Berlin after receiving death threats from survivors, faced political consequences that reached the highest levels of Nazi leadership. His public assurances that Hamburg was invulnerable had been broadcast repeatedly over Reich radio. Citizens who had remained in the city based on official promises of protection now blamed party authorities for deaths that proper evacuation might have prevented. Hitler's response to Hamburg demonstrated the psychological impact on German leadership. His August 3rd conference with military commanders, documented in Wehrmacht archives, revealed a leader whose confidence in German technological superiority had been fundamentally shaken. For the first time in the war, Hitler questioned whether German science and industry could match Allied capabilities, a doubt that would influence every subsequent strategic decision. The industrial implications of Hamburg's destruction created cascading effects throughout the German war economy. Submarine construction at Bloemen-Voss had contributed 12% of all U-boats delivered to the Kriegsmarine. The synthetic fuel refineries had produced 47,000 tons of aviation gasoline monthly, enough to fuel the entire Luftwaffe fighter force for 6 days. These facilities were not merely damaged, but completely eliminated, their destruction so thorough that reconstruction was impossible with wartime resources. Port facilities that had handled imports from occupied territories were obliterated beyond salvage. The harbor infrastructure that had taken decades to construct was reduced to twisted metal extending into the Elbe River like the skeleton of some enormous prehistoric creature. Ships that had survived the bombing were trapped by debris that blocked every navigable channel, creating a maritime graveyard that would remain impassable for months. The transportation network serving Hamburg collapsed completely. Railway terminals were buried under millions of tons of rubble.
Roads were impassable due to unexploded ordnance and structural debris. The Autobahn connections that linked Hamburg to Berlin and the Ruhr Valley were severed at multiple points where bridges had been destroyed or overpasses had collapsed. The city that had served as a crucial logistics hub for the Reich's northern front was eliminated from the transportation grid entirely. Reich's Minister Albert Speer visited Hamburg on August 5 to assess reconstruction possibilities. His inspection lasted 4 hours, during which he toured only the periphery of the devastated area, because the city center remained too dangerous for human entry. His subsequent report to Hitler recommended abandoning Hamburg as an industrial center and relocating surviving facilities to underground locations in central Germany.
Admission represented acknowledgement that Allied bombing capabilities had made surface industry untenable anywhere within range of British bases. The refugee crisis generated by Hamburg's destruction strained resources across northern Germany. Nearly 1 million survivors required immediate shelter, food, and medical care. Many had lost everything except the clothes they wore during the bombing, creating logistical demands that overwhelmed civilian authorities. Refugee camps established around Bremen, Hanover, and Lübeck became permanent settlements, housing populations that had no homes to which they could return. These refugees carried with them testimonies that undermined Nazi propaganda about German invincibility and Allied weakness. Stories of bombers too numerous to count, of fires that burned hotter than steel furnaces, of defensive systems that failed completely, spread throughout the Reich despite censorship efforts. The psychological impact of Hamburg extended far beyond the city's borders, creating doubt and fear in populations that had previously felt secure behind German air defenses. Intelligence reports from the Reich Security Main Office documented the collapse of civilian morale in urban areas following Hamburg. Citizens in Berlin, Munich, and Cologne began evacuating voluntarily, convinced that their cities would suffer similar destruction. Factory workers in the Ruhr Valley demanded construction of deep underground shelters, threatening strikes if adequate protection was not provided. The confidence that had sustained German civilian cooperation was evaporating as Hamburg's fate became known. Allied Bomber Command recognized Hamburg as a demonstration of what strategic bombing could accomplish when properly executed. Air Marshal Arthur Harris ordered immediate preparation for similar attacks against other German cities, using Hamburg as the tactical template for area bombing operations. The success had proven that German urban areas could be systematically destroyed, transforming strategic bombing from harassment into a weapon capable of eliminating entire cities. The technological lessons learned at Hamburg were immediately applied to subsequent operations. Window became standard equipment for all Allied bombing missions. Electronic warfare specialists refined their jamming techniques based on German responses to the Hamburg attack. Navigation aids that had proved successful were installed in additional aircraft, expanding the number of bombers capable of precision night operations. German attempts to counter Allied technological advantages revealed the hopelessness of their position. Radar manufacturers worked desperately to develop systems immune to window jamming, but each innovation was countered by Allied electronic warfare advances within weeks. Night fighter tactics were revised to account for radar blindness, but pilot training programs could not produce experienced crews fast enough to replace losses. The technological arms race had become a rout that favored the side with superior industrial capacity. Oberst Joseph Schmid's intelligence division attempted to analyze Allied capabilities based on Hamburg, producing estimates that shocked German leadership. Allied bomber production exceeded German fighter production by ratios of 8-to-1. Training programs were producing air crews faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. Most critically,
Allied logistics could sustain bombing operations at Hamburg's intensity indefinitely, while German defensive resources were already stretched beyond capacity. The economic calculations were equally devastating. Hamburg had required one night and 2,300 tons of bombs to destroy completely. Germany possessed approximately 200 cities of comparable industrial importance. At Hamburg's rate of destruction, Allied Bomber Command could eliminate German urban industrial capacity within 2 years, assuming no increase in Allied capabilities and no degradation of German defenses. Both assumptions were optimistic.
Beyond reason. Reich's Marshal Goering's response to Hamburg reflected the desperation of German leadership. His August 10th directive ordered the construction of 3,000 underground aircraft factories, safe from Allied bombing, but requiring resources that would eliminate surface production entirely. The defensive mentality that Hamburg had imposed on German planning represented strategic defeat disguised as tactical adaptation. Local Nazi officials who had survived Hamburg's destruction found their authority completely undermined. Citizens who had trusted party promises of protection refused to cooperate with evacuation orders, civil defense preparations, or industrial mobilization efforts. The credibility that Nazi ideology required for effective governance had been incinerated along with Hamburg's residential districts. The international implications of Hamburg extended beyond German borders. Neutral nations that had maintained trade relationships with the Reich began reconsidering their positions after witnessing what Allied industrial capacity could accomplish. Swiss intelligence reports noted that Hamburg's destruction had demonstrated Allied capability to eliminate any target within bomber range, making continued neutrality potentially suicidal if circumstances changed. Occupied territories across Europe experienced immediate changes in resistance activity following Hamburg. Partisan organizations that had previously focused on harassment operations began planning for major uprisings, convinced that German military collapse was imminent. Civilian populations that had collaborated with occupation authorities began hedging their positions, preparing for post-war reckoning with enemies who possessed unlimited destructive capability. Klaus Brenner, the radar operator whose confident predictions had been shattered along with his equipment, represented thousands of German military personnel whose faith in technology and training had been destroyed at Hamburg. His medical records, preserved in Wehrmacht archives, documented complete psychological breakdown triggered by confronting capabilities that exceeded his understanding of what warfare could accomplish. His experience embodied the broader German military tragedy. Professional soldiers who had conquered most of Europe discovered that their enemies possessed weapons and tactics that rendered conventional military thinking obsolete. The courage, skill, and determination that had achieved victory from Poland to the gates of Moscow were meaningless against enemies who had industrialized destruction itself. The systematic nature of Allied superiority became clear through detailed analysis of Hamburg's destruction. Every aspect of the operation, from weather forecasting to target selection, from electronic warfare to post-strike assessment, demonstrated organizational capabilities that German military doctrine assumed were impossible for democratic societies. The stereotypes that had supported Nazi ideology about Allied weakness and disorganization had been completely inverted by Hamburg's reality. German scientific institutions attempted to develop countermeasures to Allied bombing techniques, but their efforts revealed the comprehensive nature of the technological gap. Research programs that should have required years of development were needed immediately. Manufacturing capacity that should have been available was committed to replacing conventional equipment destroyed faster than it could be produced. The industrial resources required to match Allied capabilities simply did not exist within the Reich. Professional military assessments of Hamburg reached conclusions that German leadership could not acknowledge publicly.
General der Fliege Adolf Gallen's classified report stated that continuation of the war under existing conditions would result in Germany's complete destruction within 18 months. His recommendations for immediate negotiated settlement were rejected, but the strategic realities he identified could not be ignored. The Hamburg survivors who radically changed their perspectives represented a massive shift within German society. Rational enough before Hamburg to consider the Nazi regime as perhaps a necessary evil, or even an admirable vehicle for restoring German power and prestige, they became irrecoverably alienated after witnessing the hellstorm of Hamburg.
Scattered across Germany carried with them knowledge that undermined every assumption upon which Nazi victory had been predicated. They had witnessed American industrial capacity applied to systematic destruction, observed Allied technological coordination that exceeded German theoretical capabilities, and experienced bombing techniques that transformed entire cities into furnaces within hours. Their testimonies, despite censorship efforts, created psychological transformation throughout German society. The invincibility that Nazi propaganda had proclaimed was revealed as illusion. The technological superiority that German education had emphasized was demonstrated to be fictional. The racial theories that justified war were contradicted by Allied capabilities that surpassed German achievements in every measurable category. Hamburg burned until August 3rd. When rainfall finally extinguished the last fires consuming the city's ruins. The smoke clouds that had risen 3 kilometers into the atmosphere dissipated slowly, revealing a landscape that belonged to some other planet. Where Germany's second-largest city had stood for 8 centuries, there remained only rubble-filled basements and twisted metal sculptures that had once been buildings. The final casualty figures compiled by Hamburg civil authorities confirmed the completeness of the destruction. 43,000 dead, though thousands more remained missing and were presumed incinerated completely. 125,000 wounded, many of whom would die from their injuries over the following months. 900,000 homeless, representing more than half the city's population. An urban center that had contributed significantly to German war production had been eliminated as thoroughly as if it had never existed. The industrial statistics were equally devastating. Submarine production capacity reduced to 0. Synthetic fuel production eliminated entirely. Port facilities destroyed beyond reconstruction. Transportation networks severed permanently. The city that had ranked second in the Reich for military production had been removed from the German war economy in a single night of bombing. The psychological impact proved as permanent as the physical destruction. German military personnel who had witnessed Hamburg learned that modern warfare recognized no distinction between combatants and civilians, between military targets and residential areas. The total war that Nazi ideology had proclaimed had been turned against Germany by enemies whose industrial capacity exceeded every prediction about democratic military potential. Klaus Brenner spent the remainder of the war in a military hospital, staring at walls and clutching the burned photograph of his daughter Emma. His radar screens would never again track incoming aircraft. His confidence in German technology permanently shattered by enemies who had transformed warfare into an industrial process. His breakdown represented the psychological collapse of an entire military system, confronted by capabilities that exceeded its comprehension. The technological revolution that Hamburg represented continued accelerating throughout the war's remainder. Allied bombing techniques refined through Hamburg's destruction were applied to Berlin, Dresden, and dozens of other German cities. The industrial capacity that had made Hamburg possible expanded continuously, producing bombers and bombs faster than German defenses could be rebuilt or reinforced. German defenders who survived Hamburg learned history's most bitter lesson about modern warfare.
Industrial supremacy had become the decisive factor in military conflict, rendering individual courage and tactical skill irrelevant when facing enemies with unlimited production capability. They had brought determination and training to a contest decided by factory output and technological innovation. The mathematics of strategic bombing, written in Hamburg's ashes, demonstrated that urban industrial societies could be destroyed systematically by enemies with sufficient resources and technological capability.
Promised to resist indefinitely had been eliminated in hours by aircraft that appeared from darkness, delivered destruction beyond imagination, and vanished into night, leaving behind ruins that would serve as monuments to the new age of warfare they had witnessed. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.